Greetings, my fellow Marylanders. From high atop the state, I'm Garrett County Commission Chair Paul Edwards, and you're tuned in to the Conduit Street Podcast, the place to learn about the policy and politics impacting Maryland counties today.
Hello and welcome to the Conduit Street Podcast. Kevin Kinnally here with Michael Sanderson. On January 17th, Michael, session is well underway. I feel like things have gotten off to a much quicker start this year. Maybe we said that before, but man, it's off to a fever pitch pace.
I'm feeling it too. No, I don't think it's just us. I think everybody around town has noticed there's a little whiplash, right? Like we're off to a fast start.
Yes. So what are we going to do today, Michael? Obviously, big news this week in Annapolis.
Yeah, I think this is one of the days that, I don't know, like I'll count myself among the nerd community. We always figure that the 8th day of session is when the governor has to introduce a budget. And usually all the other pieces of the fiscal plan get introduced and submitted to the General Assembly. And usually that's a tone setter for what the session is going to be about. The governor's plan is not always the final plan, but the first draft shows like how serious a deliberation is it going to have to be to get to a balanced budget for this year and to have a fiscal plan going forward. So it's always a tone setter. We knew this was going to be a tough year. So it's not like this was a happy day, but you circle it on the calendar knowing this is going to be a pivot point for the 90-day session.
Yes, so we want to dig into the fiscal plan a bit. We'll talk about the top line numbers and major elements that are getting coverage everywhere. And then we'll dig deeper into the local effects because that's why you're here.
Right. I hope that's why you're here. But no, we do our best to try and cover the big picture of state and local policy and that sort of stuff. For today, I mean, there's a lot of coverage out there about the big picture stuff. So we can talk through that a bit, but I do think it's worth getting into some of the issues that are going to affect county level services and functions and that sort of stuff. That is our brand after all. So yeah.
Right. And so overall, first, I'll mention that we do have a fairly thorough write-up on the plan on the Conduit Street blog. So grab that if you're looking for the top line. You can use it to follow along with us as well. But you'll also find the effects on county governments from this proposed budget from the governor and the fiscal plan. So, Michael, there's a lot there to dig into.
Right. And I think hats off to you, Kevin. You did the yeoman's work of sort of pouring through these long bills and picking out pieces that have some county effects and so forth. We're still in the process of doing the fine print work here. I will say for folks who want the deep dive and some of this sort of translated to lay English, Monday afternoon, the legislative staff, the Department of Legislative Services, will do its big fiscal briefing. That's usually 3:00 on Monday. I haven't checked the schedule. I'm assuming that's when it is again this year. But Monday afternoon is usually when they unveil. The legislative staff kind of goes through, and sometimes their analysis is a little maybe more bite-sized. Like here's a 1 page of here are the things that resolve the closing deficit. We started with this number. You do these things that brings it to here. You do these things that brings it to there. And now the bottom line is whatever, $80 million in the till or something along those lines. They usually make it easy to follow and read. So more stuff coming from the experts at the legislative staff. They're the nonpartisan staff agency to the General Assembly. They'll make a presentation to legislative leaders on Monday. They'll also be joining the MACO Legislative Committee in a couple of weeks to give an abbreviated version of that.
Always look forward to that. They do a great job. So, Michael, big picture here. The problem in the fiscal 26 budget, which is the one they need to pass this session, was close to $3 billion, right? We heard a lot about that leading into session. The governor talked a lot about that at the MACO Winter Conference and kind of signaled that was what was ahead, and his staff and his team. He also talked about it at the summer conference, I should say. So he signaled that he'd be making, Michael, $2 billion in cuts, and that left $1 billion or so in revenues to fill the gap. This plan shows all of that, mostly in the budget reconciliation bill, the BRFA. And Michael, we've talked a lot about the BRFA before, the big BRFA.
Right. Yeah. The big BRFA is the sort of parlance around Annapolis for this. But the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, almost every year there's a bill that rides along with the budget itself. I mean, in the Maryland Constitution, there's specific references to the budget bill. It's just the 1 year spending plan, and it can restrict funds and spend funds and authorize the agencies to do this and that and spend money on that. But that's all you can do in the budget bill. And then there's a special process for that. The governor can't veto the budget bill. It's a whole different thing. It's sort of a one of one deal. If you need to make changes to laws, there might be a formula or a requirement in the law. And if you don't have the money to accomplish all those things, you might need to tweak some of those laws, or you might need something to say, notwithstanding our usual process, let's transfer $40 million from this fund to that fund, bring it into the general fund, that kind of thing. All that stuff needs to be in a standalone bill, and that's the reconciliation bill, the BRFA. So even in fairly calm years, we have a bill like that. This year, it's a pretty big, complicated one because there's a lot of stuff in it.
Right. And Michael, we have not yet seen the governor's education bill. We know that's going to be a big part of this plan. He laid out some broad strokes at the MACO conference in December. But the bill that we will see will answer some of the questions once we do see it, right? We know that there's also an economic development bill coming. That's a big focus for the governor. He's talked a lot about Maryland being asset rich, but strategy poor. A big part of that is economic development. So we know we'll see a bill like that. It's likely that counties will have some stake in that. And there's some other stuff too, with likely, at least some fiscal effects for counties, right? So that's kind of where we are. That's the top line, Michael. And I'll just make some notes here. I think that it's a $65.3 billion budget. It does reduce the structural deficit. It does maintain reserves for economic challenges. We've heard a lot about that. Should you tap into the rainy day fund? Is it raining? It does maintain reserves. And it does balance some targeted investments with cost-cutting measures to address some immediate and long-term priorities for the governor. For counties, it presents opportunities and challenges. It does increase funding for K through 12 education. We know a lot of that is driven by the blueprint. Good news for transportation aid in terms of transit. Also, we're not going to cut highway user revenues, which is what we need for our roads to keep them safe. Last year, there was a lot of talk about that. We're not getting a cut, but it is important to remember, Michael, that we still fall off a cliff when it comes to road money in fiscal 28, 27. So we're going to need to shore that up and make sure that moving forward, we don't fall off a cliff with money that we need to keep roads safe. The proposed budget also, though, reduces disparity grants for counties with the greatest needs. Some of those counties see reductions. That's formulaic driven, but of course, we never think that's a good idea. It does introduce additional cuts to aid programs that counties rely on. And the budget does rely on some temporary funding sources, so that creates some uncertainty moving forward. Michael, the BRFA that we talked about, that's where most of the action is for county governments. We've seen before this proposal to shift a lot of the assessment costs. Maryland has a very, very good centralized assessment structure for property tax assessments. We see, again, a proposal to shift most of the costs for a state agency that handles those assessments onto counties. We know that a lot of our folks are going to care about a plan to phase out enterprise zone credits from the state. So this is I think, puts and takes. I think that the governor and his staff, I think when they kind of thought that things would work out in a wash for county governments, there'd be some puts and takes. But at the end of the day, we'll have to see how it all shakes out. A lot of this is dependent on revenue projections, Michael, and we know those can be up and down. The economy is crazy. There's a lot of uncertainty in DC. So we'll have to see how it shakes out. But top line, I mean, it's not nearly as bad as a lot of people thought it would be for county governments. So I guess you could say that's good news.
I think for listeners who have been, like, if you've been following the last few weeks in the newspapers and with the reporters and folks who are covering state policy issues and so forth, we've got a variety of vessels who are trying to cover Annapolis, online sites and newspapers and so forth. So if you've been following the drumbeat for the last few weeks, you kind of heard the governor float, okay, it's going to be $2 billion in cuts. And what we mean by that is, like, not just service cuts, we're going to stop doing things, but it includes like shifting money from here to there, and we won't put some money into there that we otherwise would have, and we'll flat fund this item instead of letting it grow. Like, all that kind of stuff collectively are reductions in spending that otherwise would have happened. But $2 billion in cuts and shifts and transfers and that so forth, and then like $1 billion or so in new revenue of some sort. I feel like the general shape of this plan is not all that surprising. I mean, we knew there had to be specifics, and we've seen some specifics in what's going to happen with our income tax structure and revenues, and some specific things for transportation, like you mentioned, and so forth. So we've got some more details to walk through, but like the general shape is pretty much the way, like they carved the outline for this in advance of the formal announcement, I feel. And there are some, like you use the term puts and takes. I think that's fair. Like there's a little more nuance in some of these items. Like the income tax thing has like 5 or 6 layers to it, rather than just here's the new income tax bracket and here's what it raises. It's like, well, we're doing this, but we're also doing that, and a little bit of this over here to offset the effect of that. There's maybe more like sprinkling of thoughtful additions along the way that I might have guessed, but I don't know. I don't think anybody would look at this and say this was a giant shock. I think it's pretty much like down the fairway, honestly.
And all this is in a bill too, Michael. I think it's important to remember that. I think a lot of people look at the budget, the fiscal plan right now, and they think, okay, that's it. That's what we're going to have to deal with. But you need to remember, you mentioned income tax. There are some massive changes in here in Maryland's income tax structure. So the General Assembly has to agree with all of these things. And I think there are so many balls in the air here, Michael, in this fiscal plan. There are so many things that rely upon one another to make things work that if you make one change, it can affect everything else. So it's really important to remember that, yes, this is the fiscal plan for now. This is what's under consideration in the General Assembly, but it's almost certain that they're going to put their mark on this plan. And depending on what they do, other things may come out of alignment and the whole fiscal plan kind of doesn't work. So a lot of work to be done here, Michael, but it's important to remember all the stuff is in a bill. They have to pass a budget. And so we'll see what everything looks like once the General Assembly finishes their work and how that plan balances out.
Right. So what you get out of mid-January is a pretty clear sense of the dimensions of what the plan needs to look like. Like you need to do things that amount to this total sort of dollar amount. So if it turns out there are pieces of this plan that the General Assembly doesn't like, and I think there's a pretty good chance that that's going to happen. Well, if we don't like this piece and it's $150 million toward the $3 billion problem, you got to find $150 million in cuts or shifts or transfers or new revenues or something else. So that's that's sort of where we are, is like the size of the plan is basically set. And if some of the specifics won't make it to the end, then they need to be replaced by something else.
Right. And so let's make a run through of some of the items that our leaders, county officials, are going to feel directly as a result of this, Michael. Should we start with the income tax, because we've kind of hinted that there's big changes on the way with income tax?
Right. I think that's one of the attention grabbers here, and I think that's worth doing. I'll point out another item that you put on the Conduit Street blog that tries to give a little run through of when state tax policy changes affect counties. And the answer is it's not all the time. The big takeaway there is the rates are the states, but the amount is what counts if you're a county person.
Is that your mnemonic device, Michael?
I mean, I think it kind of works, right? I mean, if you're the finance person for a county government, if the state says we want to have a new bracket on high earners, and that's part of this plan, and we're going to tax their taxable income at a higher percentage after this many dollars, that doesn't flow through to the county. It's what matters to us is the amount of their taxable income, but there are some pieces of this plan that affect that, so it does flow down.
And here, Michael, there are changes in opposite directions. They're increasing the standard deduction more than double, from $4,500 to $11,000. That's quite a big jump.
Right. So that's like, we're familiar with the concept of tax write-offs, right? And on your federal tax form, you might choose to itemize deductions and so forth and say, well, I did this and I did that, and I write this sort of stuff off, and I shouldn't be taxed on that income. So the twist here is this plan makes the standard deduction, where you don't have to itemize all the things, you just take a chunk. The standard deduction becomes substantially more generous, but the state's no longer going to have state level itemized deductions. So that's like arrows pointing in opposite directions.
Right. And so that's hard to tell what this whole thing means for counties then, right? Because if you were already taking the standard deduction, that goes up, so your taxable income comes down. The state is making some rate changes that likely offset that, but not the counties. So we will likely lose revenue there.
Right. But also for the taxpayers who have like big, complicated returns, lots of business interests or lots of, other sorts of complicated things, they won't be able to itemize anymore at the state level. So their deduction, presumably the reason you would be itemizing is because you have more than the standard if you tally up the full list. So if their deduction comes down, that's a larger taxable income base, and that would be more revenue that goes back for county services. So again, we'll have to see the numbers there. I don't know. I suspect the comptroller's office can sort of run this against past returns and give a decent forecast of what we think it'll look like.
Right. So it might not be uniform. It certainly won't be. And it depends probably upon how many high income taxpayers a county has. But Michael, we know that those big hitters, these people, it's really hard to predict their tax behavior, right? If they're taking capital gains this year, if they aren't. So we have a number of really big hitters in Maryland, and what they do moves the needle statewide. So it'll be interesting to see how that shakes out. But I think, Michael, when you've heard the governor talk about 82% of Marylanders get a tax cut, this is what we're talking about, right? Raising the standard deduction is probably what he's talking about here.
Right. I mean, several $1,000s that just goes from being taxable to non-taxable. And that's a meaningful chunk for most Maryland residents. And that for a lot of people, that's going to be the bigger change than this other stuff all lumped together.
Okay, so we're partially along for the ride on some income tax policy shifts. Again, pretty substantial income tax policy shifts at the state level. But there are other areas that are direct shifts that do affect counties, Michael, right?
Right. And I mean, we don't love this. Like, there's some stuff we got to talk through that the counties aren't going to be happy about, and that they're going to make things more challenging to do a county budget. I mean, the reality check here is, with a problem this large, $3 billion is a big eye-popping number. You can't be surprised or shocked that counties, I mean, the state relies on counties to deliver an awful lot of frontline services, but when they can't afford every penny in their budget, they got to look everywhere. So we can't be shocked if we're being called to the table to be part of the resolution. Like, one of the pieces that's a kind of a big number is on the cost of providing public employee pensions. You want to talk about that first?
Yeah, so I mean, we don't have all of the details, but we surely do know that there's some sort of calculation or formula at work here. In the bill itself, there's just a $92 million pension shift for local school systems onto county governments from the state. Michael, there's also, and we'll get into this second, there's a shift for community college retirement costs onto counties, and that's a new one. But let's talk about the school pension shift first.
Right. So, I mean, the tricky thing here is, I kind of thought once we saw the budget reconciliation bill, we'd see like 6 paragraphs that explain how this is calculated. And instead, the bill literally just has, here's a column of numbers. And so I don't know. I'm old school. I used to work with the legislative staff and so forth, and I sat and I typed out formulas and put them into law and that sort of thing. So I'm old school. I like it that way. But in this case, I mean, there's something to be said for, this is clear as a bell, right? If you're St. Mary's County and you want to know what the effect is, if it were written as a formula, you'd have to have somebody explain it to you. When it's written right in the bill, you can look at it and say, oh, well, our number is like $1.562 million. There's no ambiguity because it's literally written right into the bill. So, St. Mary's County, a sort of middle-sized county, population about 100,000, they're in for $1.5 million, $1.6 million or thereabouts, which is basically just going to be an invoice from the state. That's to help pay the cost of the state pension system.
So, I mean, these are costs of the state pension system being invoiced to counties. That's essentially what's happening here.
Right. And I mean, it's weird and awkward in a number of ways. Like, counties, we don't run the pension system. Like, we don't set the benefit rates. We don't determine how generous the pension is or what the employees have to contribute or other, all the terms for when you can retire, when do you vest, all those sorts of things. Every bit of that, all those decisions are made at the state level. And this is essentially pension costs for public school teachers. And to some degree, it's employees at community colleges or libraries. But for the most part, this is driven by public school teachers. Wow, pensions getting a little more pricey as people are making more money. And why is that? Because of the state's blueprint, right? I mean, the state, we're in the middle of this big ramp up of investment in public school teachers through the blueprint, hiring more, paying them more, recruit and retain, all that sort of stuff. I mean, there's no surprise that the cost of teacher pensions is going up. I mean, it's an obvious outcome of state policy that they've adopted. Nonetheless, price tag comes up, so it turns into a invoice to counties and they'll pick up a share.
Right. And this $92 million, it's forever, Michael. It's not just for a couple years to help us get through things. But okay, Okay, we'll see how much attention that gets, but since it's not reducing the pension benefits, it's just changing the who pays. It will basically just be county governments who raise concern here, Michael. I do want to point out one other thing when it comes to the teacher pensions. Back years ago, and some of people will remember, of course, and it probably is PTSD, the state shifted a lot of these pension costs onto counties. And part of the deal there was, Michael, that the state was going to provide some supplemental grants for counties to help them with those costs. But it looks like those supplemental grants that, again, some counties received to help with the shift, and that was, again, part of the deal. The state said, we will step up and we're going to provide you with these grants to ease the burden. It looks like that's just completely wiped out, Michael, and those supplemental retirement grants will be gone. And again, that was designed to help counties absorb the pension shift from years ago.
Right. I think that's true. It was part of the way to make the shift that happened a little over a decade ago relatively, manageable for local jurisdictions. But part of that was about the locals' ability to pay and absorb these costs. I mean, this grant program, this is weird. It's like just in the back of the bill, it's a one sentence that says such and such section of law is now repealed. So you don't even see the body of the grant program in the bill. You have to kind of know where to look. I will say also, like, this is close to $30 million. It's not evenly distributed. This is part of a special deal. And it was reflecting jurisdictions who don't have a lot of high earners, who don't have a lot of local wealth base to tap into to offset these costs. So, Baltimore City and Prince George's County are the lion's share of that particular grant program. So that's kind of weird as we're trying to make do with a tough state budget. It's some of our less wealthy jurisdictions are going to lose the aid that they've been counting on the state to help them keep up with the pack.
So, Michael, weird angle here again of the blueprint is that one of the most progressive policies in the state is now end up being financed by some of the poorest jurisdictions and taxpayers. And that is, we've talked about that before, but the way the numbers shake out and to eliminate some of these grants for some of the poorest jurisdictions, it's hard not to say that a very progressive policy is being financed by some of the most poorest jurisdictions and taxpayers in the state.
Yeah. And we basically know where this has to come from, right? If you tell jurisdictions they've got to do more in a meaningful way, $10 million chunks, that's not the kind of stuff that you could do with, we'll just change the recordation tax rate by 0.25%. No. You don't make real money other than with the income tax and the property tax. Those are your two workhorses that really pull the weight for county governments. And most of our counties, including Baltimore City and Prince George's, are already at their maximum rate on the income tax. So you've tapped out one workhorse. The only thing left is property tax. So that's where the jurisdictions are going to have to go to make up this space. I don't know if it means they have to raise taxes this year, but as a practical matter, to come up with this money, it's going to be pressure on the local property tax. And, it's like that's pressure on the housing market, which we all know is in a great deal of distress. That's pressure on the nominal, like we're trying to keep this as a relatively progressive tax structure and funding structure. And this is going backwards on that.
Right. And Michael, we know over 2/3 of Marylanders live in counties with the maximum local income tax rate. So the only place they can go is to the property tax. We have some bills that look to create some more flexibility there, but no doubt, Michael, that you pull a lever over here and it has an effect. And if we're having to rely on property taxes, that does put more pressure on the housing market. I think that's a great point. So it's not hard to connect the dots here. Now, we know there are other changes coming to the blueprint, and the governor has talked a lot about that in broad strokes, and he did that at the MACo Winter Conference. We've heard a lot about collaborative time and possibly a pause there. So I'm sure there will be a philosophical connection made there, Michael, but we know there are big changes coming for the blueprint.
Right. I think that's fair.
Okay, so let's get into an old favorite, Michael, the assessments office. I mentioned this earlier. We don't manage it. We don't make decisions on how they do things. But right now, counties reimburse the state for 50% of the centralized assessment system for property. And under the governor's fiscal plan, counties would now be paying for 90% of it. Michael, this is an oldie but a goodie. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, this one just rears its head again. Like for years, we've seen this thing thrown against the wall. Every time there's a budget crisis, somebody says, hey, we can just save a bunch of money by billing the counties for this service, and or make them take it over or bill them for the costs or whatever. Let's just get this off our plate. And for years, the legislators always hear from their staff and from the counties like this is a bad idea. In the past, they've always been able to say, okay, we don't need, it's a relatively small number, but we don't need it so badly to engage in what feels like shaky and kind of bad policy. I don't know if this is the year that the numbers are just so overwhelming and big that they feel like they have to do this. I don't have a great forecast there. We've fended this off. Like you and I have worked on this issue, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 different cycles of this being proposed and rejected. So it's back on the plate, right?
Yeah, Michael, I mean, look, there is a fiscal cost to this, but I mean, more than that, I think it's a policy misstep. It's a misguided move. I mean, Maryland assessment system works because it is centralized, it is impartial, and it is uniform, and that promotes fairness and consistency across the state. So I think more so, it is a fiscal issue, but it's minor, it's negligible in terms of a $3 billion problem. But I think, again, the bigger issue is the policy shift. Maryland does this the right way. So if you have a $3 billion problem and you do this, you still have a $3 billion problem. We know there are stories out there from other states where the assessment process has gotten so politicized and sometimes really warped because they don't have the separation that we do. The centralized system works very well. Maryland does this the right way. I think it's a huge policy misstep to try and alter this. And again, I don't know what you get from it. It's a negligible number. So trading sound policy for negligible budget savings, to me, that's not a good idea.
Right. Yeah, we don't have a final fiscal down on this, but to put it in context, if the overall scale of this plan is $3 billion, like shifting the assessment functions, through invoices to counties and so forth, like that's not 10% of the plan. It's not even 1% of the plan. So it's a relatively small number in the cosmic scale. We just don't know whether it's going to. I will say you're right about we do this the right way. Like we have policy people come from other states to Maryland specifically to look at how we're doing this and how they wish they were doing it the smart way like Maryland does. It would be kind of embarrassing for us to just say, all right, we're going to join the dum-dums here, right? Anyway, so it goes.
Yeah, I could talk about this for hours, Michael. It gets my blood pressure up, and I don't even want to get into like the dark store theory argument. That's another episode and another time. But my blood pressure rises because of this one. Again, there is a small fiscal issue for counties, but I think the bigger issue here is the policy issue. So, Michael, let's bring my blood pressure down just a bit. I'm going to give you another chance to stand on a soapbox here. So the BRFA proposes to take $230 million, a big number, from the local income tax reserve account. Michael, are you ready to jump on this soapbox? Are you angry about this? Tell us your thoughts about the local income tax reserve account and shifting funds from that account to cover general fund expenses from the state.
Okay, so this is another familiar story, right? We've seen this chapter of the story before. I'm not flipped out about this. I've got some degree of culpability that this is a live issue. We'll explore that in a Patreon version of the podcast someday.
When we talk about dark store theory, we'll wrap that in too.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, exactly. For the paying customers, we'll go deep on this stuff. Anyway, I mean, this account, they call it the local income tax reserve account. This account's basically, I think of it as, it's like the checkbook they use to send each county its share of their local income taxes.
Right, because the state collects on our behalf, right, and then ships them out to the counties based on where the money needs to go.
Right. Like, slobs like us, we get our paycheck every couple of weeks. You look at the stub, and there's some money pulled out for Social Security and for federal taxes and for state and local taxes. That state piece is being sent to the comptroller's office, and they know that when money comes in through the state income tax system, some of it is for the state tax and some of it is for the county tax. And they don't know in that instant exactly what, well, they had $40 withheld from this employee. We don't know whether she lives in Howard County or Prince George's County. We don't know that at that moment. But we generally know that when we bring in $1 million, something like, I don't know, 300,000 of $1 million is probably county stuff. So we'll peel that off, set it into a reserve account, and eventually we'll use that money. Once we'll make estimates, we'll send it out to the counties, and then we'll square that up at the end of the year. So like this is basically saying, hey, there's a big balance in that fund that's used to send the counties their money. We could take some cash out of this balance and send them some IOUs.
So, I mean, I think, Michael, when people see that $230 million number, a lot of people will immediately think, does this mean that counties will get shorted on the next distribution from the state for our income tax revenue?
Right. And importantly, no, this doesn't say anything like that. This doesn't say that the next distribution to the counties will only be up to what's sitting in that, that management reserve account or whatever. Like, there's no policy change here. It's literally just, do they sit on this money as cash, or do they spend it and pay it back later because we're in something of a crisis? So, for accounting purposes, we carry a pretty big balance in that fund. Nominally, that's like the accountants will say you're supposed to account for possible future refunds and things like that. But it's weird to sit on hundreds of millions in cash and be doing things like raising taxes and abridging services and things like that. So here they've just proposed, take some money out of that fund now, give the fund a big IOU and pay it back later. And the bill spells that out. But the money is still there for our local distributions.
Yeah, so we know this is pretty nerdy and in the weeds, but we know that at least some of our listeners will really hate this. I know I've heard from at least a few of those people. So I think it was worth walking through this, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is it would be a crisis for us if they said we're going to eclipse these local distributions and you're not going to get the full value of your local income taxes. But if you're in county government, this doesn't change the state's obligation at all. So eventually the person who earns $1,000 in your county and you're a 3.2% county like most are, you're going to still get your share, right? Like the calculation is going to be exactly the same. It's just going to come from a checkbook that has a slightly lower balance in it. And I think that's a wash. The state is still good for their word on making right. This bill doesn't change any of that.
All right, Michael, well, you sound convinced. We will wait for the comments. And well, again, I think that's a great walkthrough, and I think you hit the nail on the head. So, Michael, another thing I guess we shouldn't be surprised about, enterprise zones, we mentioned that earlier. Again, seemingly just wiped out of the BRFA bill. Michael, this is a program that is designed to incentivize businesses to come to Maryland through tax breaks. A lot of our local economic development people think this program works very well. But, Michael, we know that this program has been under assault for years from the Department of Legislative Services. They do analyses of all these programs, and every year their analysis says that this program and other ones like it don't work. They're not worth the money. They're not worth the tax breaks. So, Michael, the BRFA wipes this from the bill. This will be a big talking point, especially in the economic development community.
I think it will. I mean, the whole idea of enterprise zone is this is like an underdeveloped area in your county. And the whole program is the county and the state have like a joint process to say, yes, we agree. This is a proper target. We'd like to see more growth. We'd like to see businesses start up here and move in here. This would be a great place for it. And that's like exactly what you want, I think. But I know you've been in the room here and, the green eye shade types come in and say, well, these places aren't bustling with fantastic activity. These programs are failures. I guess that's what this builds on, is that pessimism that this program doesn't work effectively.
Right. I guess if you're looking for some cover, you can point to these reports, again, from the Department of Legislative Services that say that. So you kind of have some receipts. But, Michael, you're right. I've been in the room. I've testified on these bills. And look, we've heard from the locals that this is one of their best tools. And so I think the messaging here is going to be difficult from the governor. He talked a lot about winning the decade and making sure that our underdeveloped areas are moving forward. And enterprise zones, if you go and talk to a lot of the counties and you put your boots on the ground, you'll hear from them that this is kind of the perfect tool, that they feel like it works very well. So I think there's going to be a disconnect from what the governor says about growing the economy versus the messaging back home, which is we're going to eliminate a program that you like very much and you feel is very effective. So when you think about how do you bring, projects to the blocks of Hagerstown that, necessarily you have some vacant lots and things haven't come back. In Hagerstown, I think they might tell you that the enterprise zone works very well for them. So when they hear the governor talking about winning the decade and that we need to invest in our underserved areas, but then also, nixing the enterprise zone from the state's structure, that's going to be, I think, some tough messaging back in county land.
And I also would say, like you mentioned, this bill seems to basically just drop the axe, right? This isn't like, let's let the whole thing run its course over the next 10 years and let the people who have their benefits continue to use them, but we're just not going to renew anybody or extend anybody. This is just like game's over.
Right. And I think one of the interesting things here, Michael, if you look at the bills that have been in previous sessions that look to eliminate the enterprise zone program, there's always, belt and suspender language there that says, hey, if you are a business who already is in the enterprise zone, you've been approved, and you're getting a 10 years worth of tax cuts, and we've already agreed to do that, the state will pay the remainder of its agreement for the 10 years, right? So we're going to sunset the program, but if you've already been approved, the state's going to make it whole because we've already agreed to do that. But in the BRFA, that belt and suspender language is not there. So it's very unclear in terms of what this means. If the state's just going to cut off the spigot, who's left holding the bag? Are the counties left holding the bag? Do these businesses just not get their tax breaks? It's unclear. So that makes me very uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So, like, as you can tell, there are a handful of things. Like, if you listen through this, we're kind of going point by point on things that are going to trickle down and affect county budgets, county services, and so forth. And I mean, all this is against a backdrop where, in all candor, the state's mandate to fund education more aggressively, more rapidly, schools are first, is the setting for all this sort of stuff. So you lose a $10 million grant that was supposed to help you support your education costs, or you end up having these new cost shifts that land on the county's lap. It just is going to make things that much more difficult for the counties to fund their share of the blueprint and go on and on beyond that. So I think the counties will have some things to say about this plan. We usually show up and give some broad testimony at the big, a day-long hearing on the budget reconciliation bill. We'll have some things to say in the days and weeks ahead. I think it's pretty likely we're going to probably find another thing or two that's in the text of the BRFA bill that we might have missed in our first run through, that somebody will say, hey, what's this set of brackets back here? Oh, poof, there's a couple $1 million gone or something like that. It happens, right? So, like, that's the next week or two for counties, is sift through this stuff, figure it all out. But, like, we'll have some things to say, I think.
Yeah, and again, we're still going through. We have a lot of coverage on the blog, so please go ahead and take a look at that. And we are updating that coverage as we receive more information and we hear from more counties. But Michael, everyone's buckled up. $3 billion is a lot. It's not like county governments are being singled out. It's not like the whole plan is about counties. But like you said, it makes things more difficult to fund the blueprint. We're partners in funding the blueprint. If the counties can't fund the blueprint, the whole thing doesn't work. So I think it's important to recognize that. I think it's important to recognize that counties don't have any way to raise revenue except through the property tax. That's just the way it is. And we know the property tax is regressive. We know that would hurt some of the people we're trying to help the most. So it's tricky. It's a lot of balancing. But at the end of the day, I think we need to make sure that we're not doing a disservice to a lot of the programs the state is really invested in by, kneecapping the counties and making it so that they can't live up to the obligations the state has put upon them. So a lot to sift through. We'll certainly have things to say, but we'll see how this all shakes out.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I don't think there's room to say that we feel like we're being picked on unfairly, right? Like you said, this isn't a plan about cutting counties or shifting to counties to solve the budget. I mean, we isolated the specific things that look like they're going to be material effects on counties. There's going to be other stakeholders who are in delivering a service or in the health area, or all sorts of different fields are going to have their thing to say about a new tax, or about a shift in costs, or about an abridgment of service and so forth. There's going to be a lot to say about this plan. So, we're going to talk about our county issues, and that's like our role in this whole machine. I don't think the message here is this governor was harsh or unfair, more so than other governors. This is just like the territory we're in when the budget becomes this tricky.
Right. And Michael, I think so to kind of wrap this up for everyone who's trying to grasp what's happening here, that's the big county takeaway. There are several meaningful effects here. They do total over $100 million. That's enough to move the needle and likely make a given county's challenge in paying its bills and meeting its blueprint obligation that much tougher. And Michael, I think it's important to point out too, if you're a smaller county, a lot of your budget is mandated spending, right? So you really only have a little bit you can play with and do things with that are outside of mandated spending or discretionary. So if you're down here in Annapolis and you're looking at billions, $2 million might not sound like a lot for a county to absorb, a small jurisdiction, in the context of billions and billions of dollars. But when you put your boots on the ground and you show up and you see what that means, it's tough. So it's important to remember scale here, and that a couple $1 million here or there may not sound like a big deal, but it is.
Yep, I think that's well said. That's it.
All right, so we'll leave it there for today. But even more important than usual, keep following the Conduit Street blog on the Mako website. Every day, especially during session, you'll see all of our testimony. You can read all of our testimony. We're updating you on the latest trends, budget issues, everything in policy areas that affect county government. So we'll continue covering those details. And then on the proposals that land on county government services, we'll make sure to break those down as well. But again, we're going to leave it there for today. If you enjoy the podcast, please go ahead and subscribe. That way, all of these episodes will be sent directly to the device of your choice. You can also follow along on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and then, of course, the Conduit Street blog. But for Michael Sanderson and our producer, Chantel Malcolm Lim, this is Kevin Kinnally signing off, and we will talk to you soon.